Lillian sat in her quiet kitchen in a modest suburb of Chicago, the afternoon sun casting long, skeletal shadows over the wooden table. She was 65 years old, a retired head nurse who had spent 40 grueling years working double shifts in public hospitals. Her hands, now slightly trembling, had comforted thousands of strangers. Yet today, they felt heavy with an unspoken dread. She had always lived a life of extreme frugality, wearing the same winter coat for over a decade to save every penny. Across from her sat her only son, Ethan, a 37-year-old man with a sharp suit and an even sharper smile. He was sipping the coffee Lillian had just poured, his eyes scanning the modest room with a hint of hidden calculation. Lillian had raised him alone after his father disappeared, pouring every ounce of her energy and every cent of her meager earnings into his future. She had wanted him to have the world, never realizing that in doing so, she might have created a monster of greed. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice dropping into that smooth, controlled register he used when he was about to negotiate a business deal. "I've been thinking a lot about your future lately. You're 65 now, and the world is becoming a very complicated place for someone living alone. I don't want you stressing over rising utility bills, property taxes, or confusing bank statements anymore. It's time you let someone else carry that heavy burden for you, don't you think?" Lillian paused, her ceramic cup frozen halfway to her lips as she looked at her son. A small, cold knot of apprehension began to form in the pit of her stomach. "What exactly are you suggesting, Ethan?" she asked quietly. She noticed how he avoided her direct gaze, focusing instead on the steam rising from his mug. He had always been a charming child, but lately, that charm felt like a polished mask designed to hide something much darker and more predatory beneath the surface. "I want to take full control of your finances," Ethan replied with a bright, artificial smile. "Starting from your very next pension check, we should just transfer everything directly into my personal account. I'll manage your bills, buy your groceries, and handle all the boring paperwork. You just relax and enjoy your retirement. You've earned the right to be taken care of, haven't you?" He reached across the table, patting her hand in a gesture that felt more patronizing than loving. A silent alarm blared in Lillian's chest, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. Her pension wasn't a king's ransom, but through decades of ironclad discipline, she had managed to save a respectable nest egg for her old age. She owned her small house outright and kept a secret emergency fund that no one knew about. The thought of handing over the keys to her survival to anyone, even her own flesh and blood, felt instinctively wrong, like walking blindly into a trap. "I'll have to think about that, Ethan," she replied, gently pulling her hand away from his. For a split second, a flash of genuine irritation flickered across Ethan's face, a raw emotion that he quickly suppressed behind his practiced mask of filial concern. "There's really not much to think about, Mom," he insisted, his tone sharpening slightly. "It's for your own protection. You know how many scammers target seniors these days? I'm just trying to keep your hard-earned money safe." After Ethan left that afternoon, leaving behind a thick folder of legal documents for her to sign, Lillian couldn't shake the heavy sense of unease. She began to look at her life through a different lens, noticing patterns she had previously chosen to ignore out of maternal love. Ethan earned a high salary, yet he and his wife, Chloe, never brought so much as a loaf of bread to their weekly dinners. He had borrowed several $1,000s over the last year, never once mentioning repayment. That night, driven by a restless energy, Lillian did something she had never dared to do before. She logged into her online banking portal and began to scrutinize every single transaction from the past 6 months with a magnifying glass. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she found the first discrepancy: a $2,000 ATM withdrawal from a location across town on a Tuesday when she had been bedridden with a severe fever. The realization began to sink in like a cold, heavy stone. As she scrolled further, the evidence of betrayal became overwhelming and undeniable. She found another unknown transfer for $1,500, then another for $3,000. She suddenly remembered a moment 3 months ago when Ethan had asked for her purse to find a recipe she had mentioned. While she was busy in the shower, the physical weight of the truth hit her like a blow to the solar plexus. Her own son, the boy she had sacrificed everything for, was systematically robbing her. The next morning, Lillian stood at the entrance of her bank the very second the security guard unlocked the doors. She felt small and fragile, but her mind was as sharp as a surgical scalpel. She met with the branch manager, a woman whose professional demeanor slowly shifted to genuine pity as Lillian laid out the unauthorized transactions. Mrs. Miller, the manager, sighed. "I wish I could say this was rare, but family financial abuse is a silent epidemic in this country." The formal investigation launched by the bank revealed the terrifying extent of Ethan's greed. A high-interest credit card Lillian had never applied for had been opened in her name, carrying a staggering $7,500 balance. Even more shocking, a utility bill for a luxury downtown condo, the one Ethan lived in, was being paid directly from her checking account every month. The paper trail was long, messy, and pointed directly to the man she had called her golden boy. The ultimate betrayal came when the manager discovered a $15,000 personal loan taken out in Lillian's name nearly a year ago. Ethan had forged her signature with practiced ease, and the missed payments had already decimated her once perfect credit score. Lillian walked out into the cold Chicago air feeling like a ghost. She wandered the city streets for hours, wondering how the child she had protected from every injustice had grown into a man who viewed his mother as an A-team. When Ethan called her cell phone that afternoon, Lillian let the call go to voicemail without a second thought. His message was breezy and casual, completely devoid of the guilt that should have been eating him alive. "Hey Mom, just checking in. I'll stop by tonight around 7 to pick up those signed financial papers. Make sure you've got them ready so we can get this sorted quickly. Love you." The word love sounded like a hollow mockery in her ears, a tool used for manipulation. That was the moment Lillian decided she was done being a victim of his greed. She spent the rest of the day on the phone, making frantic but calculated calls to movers, a specialized lawyer, and an aggressive real estate agent she had known for years. She worked with a feverish intensity she hadn't felt since her days in the emergency room. Every box she packed felt like she was reclaiming a piece of her stolen soul. She was no longer just a mother. She was a woman at war. On Friday evening, the air was crisp and smelled of coming rain. When Ethan and Chloe arrived at the house for their usual free home-cooked meal, they were met with a sight that made them freeze in the doorway. The house was an echoing shell of its former self. Every single piece of furniture, the large television, the handmade rugs, and even the family photos had vanished. Lillian sat alone on a single, cheap folding chair in the center of the vast, empty living room. "Mom, what the hell is going on here? Where is all your stuff?" Ethan's voice wavered between genuine panic and a strange sense of accusation. He looked around the barren room as if he expected the furniture to suddenly reappear from the shadows. Chloe stood beside him, clutching her designer handbag, her face a mask of confusion and rising anger. They looked like strangers who had wandered into a tomb, and in a way, that was exactly what Lillian's house had become to them. "I sold everything, Ethan," Lillian said, her voice sounding incredibly calm and steady in the empty space. "Every chair, every plate, and every memory. I decided I needed the liquid cash immediately. Since you were so eager to start managing my money, I thought I'd make sure I had a significant amount on hand before we finalized our new arrangement." She watched him closely, seeing the gears of his mind turning as he tried to figure out how this affected his secret plans. Ethan's face suddenly twisted into a raw, terrifying expression of rage that Lillian had never seen before. "Are you out of your mind? How are we supposed to be comfortable when we come over? How am I supposed to watch the game on Sundays?" The selfishness of his outburst was a revelation to Lillian. He wasn't worried about her well-being or where she would sleep. He was only concerned with the loss of his own personal comforts and the convenience her house provided. Chloe stepped forward, the sharp click of her expensive high heels echoing off the bare hardwood floors like gunshots. "Lillian, this is absolutely ridiculous behavior for a woman of your age. We come here every single week to keep you company so you won't be lonely, and this is how you choose to repay our kindness? You're being incredibly selfish and impulsive." The irony of being called selfish by the woman wearing jewelry paid for by Lillian's stolen pension was almost laughable. "Dinner isn't ready," Lillian said, her eyes locking onto Chloe's with an intensity that made the younger woman flinch. "In fact, there is no dinner tonight, and there won't be a dinner next week either. If you're hungry, I suggest you find a nice restaurant and pay for it with your own money for once." The silence that followed her statement was heavy and suffocating. She saw the mask of the loving son crumble completely, revealing the cold, calculating predator beneath. Ethan leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss that made the hair on the back of Lillian's neck stand up. "You need to think very carefully about what you're doing, Mother. A woman your age, alone in this city. You have no one in this world but me. If you push me away, you'll have nothing. Remember that when you're sitting here in the dark, the threat was clear, but instead of feeling fear, Lillian felt a strange, soaring sense of liberation." After they slammed the front door, the sound echoing through the empty house, Lillian finally allowed herself to exhale. In the profound silence of her barren home, she began to mentally tally the true cost of her son's love. Over the past 3 years, Ethan had stolen at least $32,000 from her. It wasn't just about the currency. He had stolen her sense of security, her dignity, and 40 years of sacrificed dreams that she could never get back. She sat in the dark for a long time, remembering the countless sacrifices she had made. She thought of the expensive sneakers she had bought him in high school that had cost half her monthly salary, and the prestigious private university tuition she was still paying off 10 years later. Every luxury he had enjoyed had been carved out of her own survival. She realized then that she hadn't been raising a son. She had been raising a parasite who viewed her only as a host. A week later, Ethan returned to the house attempting a different, softer tactic. He wore what Lillian now thought of as his manipulation smile, looking sheepish and concerned. "Mom, look, I know you sold the furniture on a weird impulse. It just proves that you're not thinking clearly these days. You're overwhelmed, and that's why you need my help more than ever. Let's just sign the papers and put this weird week behind us." He held out a gold-plated pen. Lillian looked at the expensive designer watch on his wristwatch that she now realized was likely paid for with the money meant for her heating bills. "Ethan, I know about everything," she said, her voice as cold as a winter morning. "I know about the unauthorized ATM withdrawals. I know about the secret credit card you opened. I know about the $15,000 loan you forged my signature for. I have seen the paper trail, and it leads straight to you." The fake smile on Ethan's face vanished instantly, replaced by a look of panicked denial. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mom. You're confused. You must be misreading the bank statements. Maybe it's early onset dementia? I've heard it can cause paranoia about money." The gaslighting was his final weapon, a desperate attempt to make her doubt her own sanity so he could continue his theft. But Lillian was a nurse. She knew exactly how to diagnose a liar. "I have the certified documents from the bank, Ethan. I've already spent several hours speaking with a very expensive lawyer who specializes in elder abuse," Lillian stated firmly. "What you have done is a felony. You have 2 very simple choices. You return every single cent you stole with interest by the end of the month, or I take this evidence directly to the police and file formal charges. I am not joking, and I am no longer your victim. Make your choice." Ethan's reaction shifted violently from denial to a raw, shaking rage. No one will ever believe a senile old woman over a successful businessman like me. I'll tell the court you gave me that money as a gift. I'll tell everyone you're losing your mind. He was screaming now, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. But Lillian just sat there, unmoved by his tantrum. She had seen much scarier things in the trauma ward than a spoiled man losing his grip on his lies. I have digital recordings of my consultations with the bank manager. Ethan, I have a clear paper trail of your IP address accessing my accounts. It is not my word against yours. It is your greed against the cold, hard evidence of the law, she said. He stormed out of the house, nearly breaking the door off its hinges. But for the first time in 37 years, Lillian didn't feel a shred of guilt. She felt powerful, rejuvenated, and entirely, gloriously free. Within days, Lillian moved into a small, bright apartment in a completely different neighborhood, far away from the judgmental whispers of neighbors who had believed Ethan's lies. She took the cash she had earned from the furniture sale and deposited it into a brand new account at a different bank, one where Ethan had no connections. At 65 years old, she was essentially starting over from zero, but for the first time in her life, she was truly free. While sitting in her lawyer's waiting room a few weeks later, Lillian spotted a colorful flyer on the coffee table. It's never too late to start over. Entrepreneurship program for seniors. Something about the bold letters sparked a fire in her. She joined the class the following Monday, sitting in the back row among other people with lined faces and heavy life stories. It was a room full of survivors, and for the first time in years, Lillian felt she truly belonged. When the instructor asked each student why they were there, Lillian stood up, her voice clear and strong. "I'm here because I discovered I raised a thief instead of a son," she said to the hushed room. "And now I need to find out who I am besides just being his mother. I want to build something that belongs only to me." The room erupted in spontaneous, thunderous applause. In that moment, Lillian felt the last of the shame she had been carrying finally wither away. She decided to rediscover a passion she had buried decades ago: baking. Her grandmother had taught her secret, traditional recipes for pastéis de nata and rich, dark chocolate truffles that melted on the tongue. As a struggling single mother, baking had been an expensive luxury she could never afford. Now, it was her lifeline. She began selling her treats at small local markets, and every single tart sold felt like a tiny, delicious declaration of her independence. Every dollar she earned from her baking was money that Ethan could never touch, because it came directly from her own hands and her own hard work. Meanwhile, the legal pressure from her lawyer began to mount. They discovered that Ethan had even used Lillian as an unwitting co-signer for his massive home renovation loan, facing irrefutable evidence and the threat of a prison sentence. Ethan's lawyers finally proposed a very substantial out-of-court settlement. The settlement agreement was strict. Ethan would return the full $32,000, pay an additional $10,000 in damages for the stress caused, and sign a formal public statement clearing her name of any confusion. The night before the final signing, Ethan called her. His voice was low, stripped of its usual arrogance and bravado. "Mom, can we just talk? Just the two of us? About rebuilding our family? There's always an us, isn't there?" Lillian closed her eyes, leaning against her kitchen counter. For 40 years, the word us had meant that her dreams were always secondary to his needs. "No, Ethan," she replied with a sigh that felt like letting go of a heavy weight. "There is no us anymore. There is only you dealing with the consequences of your choices, and there is me finally learning how to live for myself. We are separate people now." She hung up and went back to kneading her dough. The rhythmic folding of the pastry dough was like a form of meditation for her. At the formal signing, the next morning, Lillian didn't shed a single tear. She wore a new suit and held her head high. When they were briefly left alone in the sterile conference room, she looked at him and asked a question that had been haunting her. Why, Ethan? You had a good job and a good life. Why would you feel the need to rob your own mother of her security? Ethan couldn't even look her in the eye. He stared at the mahogany table, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. I don't know, Mom, he whispered. The first time, I just needed a bit extra for the down payment on the condo. Then it just became so easy. You never checked the balances. You never asked questions. I guess I just stopped seeing it as your money and started seeing it as mine. The simplicity of his betrayal was the ultimate insult to her. He had stolen from her simply because he knew she trusted him blindly, and that trust was a weakness he was willing to exploit. Lillian walked out of that law office with a certified check and her absolute freedom. Her small business, Lillian's Artisanal Treats, suddenly exploded in popularity after a local food influencer posted a glowing review of her custard tarts. She soon bought a small, sun-drenched apartment near the lake, nothing fancy, but entirely hers. She decorated her new home with vibrant, bold colors she had always loved, but never dared to use in her previous life. A year later, a ghost from her past appeared at her front door. It was Chloe, looking pale, exhausted, and completely stripped of her usual designer armor. She looked like a woman who had finally seen the truth. "Can I come in, Lillian?" she asked in a trembling voice. "I have nowhere else to go, and I think I finally understand." Lillian offered her a seat and a cup of tea. Watching her former daughter-in-law with a mix of curiosity and detached pity, Chloe revealed that she and Ethan were in the middle of a messy, bitter divorce. "I wasn't the only person he was lying to," Chloe admitted, her voice shaking with emotion. "There were other women, hidden secret accounts I never knew about, and a mountain of debt. You were right to leave him, Lillian. I thought you were being cruel, but now I see." That validation, coming from the very woman who had once called her selfish, was the final, necessary piece of Lillian's emotional healing. She learned that Ethan had been forced to sell his luxury condo to pay off his various debts and had moved to another state to start over in a low-level, entry-level job. He was finally experiencing the modest life he had tried to force upon his mother. And Lillian felt a strange sense of cosmic justice in that. Lillian realized that her years of sacrifice as a mother had actually been a form of enabling his worst impulses. By never setting firm boundaries, she had allowed Ethan to believe that the world and his mother owed him everything he desired. By finally saying no and demanding justice, she hadn't just saved her own life. She had given Ethan the only gift that might actually change his character: the real consequences of his own selfish actions. She sat on her balcony that evening, watching the shimmering city lights of Chicago dance on the surface of the lake. She thought of the young, exhausted mother she once was, skipping her own meals so that Ethan could have a new pair of shoes for school. She didn't regret the love she had given him, but she deeply regretted the silence and the lack of boundaries. She realized that motherhood should never be a one-way street of total self-destruction. Another year passed in a blur of flour, sugar, and newfound success. Lillian's Artisanal Treats was no longer just a small market stall. It was now a beautiful boutique shop in the heart of the city with gold-lettered windows that caught the morning sun. Lillian was 67 years old, and she often remarked to her customers that she had never felt younger or more energetic. She was finally living the life she had once only dreamed about in hospital hallways. One bright Monday morning, her old neighbor, Martha, from the old neighborhood, visited the shop. "You look completely different, Lillian," Martha observed, her eyes wide with surprise. "You look lighter, surer of yourself. It's like you've shed an old skin." Lillian smiled as she handed Martha a warm chocolate truffle. "It's because I finally learned that I deserve more than just the scraps of someone else's life," Lillian replied with a knowing wink. I spent my entire life in the trap of thinking that motherhood meant infinite, silent sacrifice without any boundaries," Lillian continued. "I thought aging meant accepting whatever tiny crumbs of attention my son decided to throw my way. I was so wrong, Martha. Aging is about finally having the courage to be yourself, regardless of what others expect of you." She felt a deep sense of pride in the woman she had fought so hard to become in her late 60s. Lillian knew that some people in her old social circles still judged her harshly for the firm distance she kept from Ethan. They would often say things like, "But he's your only son. Family is supposed to be forever, no matter what." Lillian would simply smile at them and say, "Yes, he is my son, and I will always wish him well." But love does not mean permitting someone to abuse you. True love must always include a foundation of mutual respect. She occasionally received letters from Ethan in the mail. He sent a card for her birthday and a short, polite note at Christmas. She always replied with a distant, cool courtesy, keeping the border between their lives firm and unbreakable. She had found a brand new family in her vibrant community of fellow entrepreneurs and the talented young bakers she was now mentoring. She was building a legacy that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with heart. As she closed her shop for the day, Lillian looked at a framed photo on her counter. It wasn't a photo of the past or of Ethan. It was a photo of her in the present, smiling, covered in a fine dusting of flour, standing proudly in front of her own successful business. Her true wealth wasn't just in her bank account, though it was finally full again. Her wealth was in the content of her character and the absolute peace she found in her own solitude. She had successfully traded a golden cage of maternal lies for a simple, honest life of truth, and it was undeniably the best deal she had ever made. Lillian walked to her car, feeling the strength in her legs and the clarity in her mind. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. The city of Chicago felt like her playground, a place of endless possibility, even at 67. She was the architect of her own happiness, and that was a beautiful thing. Every morning, Lillian woke up at 5 a.m., not because she had to, but because she loved the quiet stillness of the city before it roared to life. She would sip her coffee and watch the sunrise over Lake Michigan, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. The betrayal that had once threatened to destroy her had instead become the catalyst for her greatest transformation. She had learned that even the deepest wounds could eventually grow into something strong and beautiful. Her shop had become a local landmark, a place where people came not just for the pastries, but for the warm, encouraging atmosphere Lillian created. She hired other seniors who had struggled to find work, giving them a sense of purpose and a fair wage. She was creating a microeconomy of kindness and respect. She realized that by standing up to her son, she had gained the strength to stand up for an entire community of people who had felt invisible. Ethan eventually stopped writing. Perhaps he had finally realized that his mother wasn't coming back to the role of the silent martyr. Or perhaps he was finally focusing on his own life and his own path to redemption. Lillian hoped it was the latter. She didn't hold on to anger anymore. Anger was a heavy suitcase she had checked at the gate of her new life. She had replaced it with a light bag of wisdom and a very sturdy set of walking shoes. On her 70th birthday, Lillian's shop was filled with friends, neighbors, and the young bakers she had trained. There was music, laughter, and enough pasties de nata to feed the entire block. As she blew out the candles on her cake, Lillian didn't wish for anything. She already had everything she needed: her health, her dignity, and a community that truly saw and valued her for who she was, not just for what she could provide for them. She often thought about the golden boy she had once worshipped. She realized that by giving him everything, she had actually given him nothing of substance. She had taught him how to take, but she had never taught him how to give. Her biggest failure as a mother had been her own self-effacement, but she had rectified that error in the most dramatic way possible. She had shown him that even the most devoted mother has a breaking point. Lillian's story began to spread beyond the neighborhood. She was invited to speak at senior centers and women's groups about financial independence and the importance of setting boundaries with adult children. She spoke with a raw honesty that moved people to tears. She became a beacon of hope for those who felt trapped in cycles of family obligation and abuse. She told them, "It's never too late to reclaim your life. Your age is your power, not your cage." As the sun began to set on another busy day at the shop, Lillian sat down with a glass of wine and looked out at the street. She saw a young mother walking with her son, and she smiled softly. She hoped that mother would teach her son about respect and that she would keep a piece of herself for her own dreams. She hoped they would build a relationship based on truth rather than sacrifice. Lillian felt a deep sense of peace with her own journey. The final chapter of Lillian's life was still being written, and she was holding the pen with a firm, steady hand. She was a woman who had been robbed by her son, but had found herself in the process. She was Lillian Miller, entrepreneur, mentor, survivor, and free woman. As she turned off the lights of her shop, the gold letters on the window shimmered one last time in the twilight. A glowing testament to a life reclaimed and a spirit that refused to be broken.